And once again, we're back with the ACA podcast. My friend Stephen Smith, myself, Billy Hoffman. We've been going over adult children of alcoholics and dysfunction in this series. Do you want to kind of give an overview of what it is before we get into our next traits?
Just a brief summary. I think if anyone wants the longer version of this, you should go back to the last couple of podcasts that we've done. We did an overview talking about just the ACA laundry list and the framework, the groups in general. And then the most recent one we just did, we covered laundry list traits 1 and 2, where we talked in more detail about those. In general, we're going to be talking about a series of traits called the laundry list that are things that people may do in adulthood as behaviors that might have resulted from or come from things they experienced, witnessed, went through during childhood, if they experienced any kind of dysfunction in their family growing up.
And just took it into their adult life and wondered why. Why does this keep happening to me?
Yes.
Well, there's a reason. And we find it in the laundry list traits. So why don't we jump right into trait 3?
Yes.
And what is that one?
Trait 3, the laundry list sign, is we are frightened by angry people and any personal criticism. And the other laundry list sign, which we'll talk about in a second, is we frighten people with our anger and threat of belittling criticism. So starting with the laundry list side, we are frightened by angry people and any personal criticism. This, covers a sort of general sensitivity towards criticism. And I mean that in both an explicit and an implicit context. So there's explicit criticism, which is, someone saying, hey, that wasn't good enough, or, you're no good, or really expressly criticizing us in that way. And then there's implicit, which is like sort of the unspoken or silent criticism, which can sometimes come from what people don't say, or it is more of an implied criticism. And there's lots of examples of that, which we can maybe get into. But trait 3, generally people who relate to this are going to either identify as or maybe just notice themselves as being particularly fearful of the idea of someone being critical of them. Sometimes this can look like a defensiveness, like someone who really, at the slightest, bit of feedback can change the subject or get defensive. But there's this heightened sensitivity to the idea of criticism.
And are we saying that this person lived in a home where the parents or a parent was hypercritical of them all the time, maybe smothering in some ways?
Sure. I think that's one way it can look. I think the answer to all of these questions over the course of ACA stuff is it can depend. I think there's a version of trait 3 that can look that way. So someone may have grown up in a home where there was lots of explicit criticism. You come home with a B on a test and a parent says, why wasn't this an A? You're not working hard enough. At any sporting event, it was always, how come you messed that up? An emphasis or a focus on what was done wrong. It could be even more like in the realm of kind of like verbal emotional abuse, like, telling people that they're never going to amount to anything, they're no good at anything, they're just a screw up, or lots of worse things. And that can be the type of home that someone comes from.
So it could be hey, look, I got all B's. It should have been A's.
Yeah, exactly. And that message, that messaging continually gets sent to a kid that if the only feedback, or I'll even say the vast majority of feedback that it ever is given to them is about what they have done wrong, you can imagine how someone might internalize a self-image that starts to assume that they generally assume that most things they do are going to be wrong or are not going to be good enough. And so you may see feelings of low self-esteem, just a general sense of lack of self-confidence, a lot of questioning myself in adulthood can result from that. The other side that I like to talk about that I think is more of the implied criticism is when I think about households where maybe adults or parents didn't really give a whole lot of anything. So I come home with a B on a test, and instead of someone saying, well, why didn't you do better? They give me the cold shoulder, and they just don't even seem to care.
Or say anything.
Exactly. And it seems like nothing I ever did got their attention in any way, or didn't seem to matter at all. no, that adult is not looking me in the eyes and criticizing me. But I mean, imagine how a kid is supposed to interpret that. What conclusion are they supposed to draw other than, my efforts, my performance, my attempts to get some recognition
don't matter and I'm unimportant.
Exactly. So the end result can still be low self-esteem, low self-confidence, which are similar, but the experiences people have might look a little different.
And as an adult, why am I going to put my best effort into work or anything if that's kind of what I feel might come to me?
Sure.
Or even, the other side of that, I don't like it when the boss wants to do a review. I don't want them to tell me what they think I could do better.
Sure. I'm curious for you, if there's any extent to which you relate to trait 3. Like,
oh man,
what did it look like for you?
Lord. I will say today I really don't. I mean, some of those feelings can come up, but coming up, especially when I was still in active addiction, the trait 3 piece. If I can remember times where I was working for a company and they have people, consultants that they've hired to help me. The consultants' help will ultimately make me more money, okay? And still fighting that because I just couldn't handle it. Now, again, you heard me mention I can't remember which, it might have been both of the last 2 podcasts, or maybe the first one especially, but that the screaming and the over the top conflict, that would happen in my home growing up. The criticism piece did not sit with me well when I came of age, so to speak, and didn't have to hear it anymore if I didn't want to. Which, I mean, today I look at it as it's kind of an ignorant way to live because you're never getting any kind of feedback. Ultimately, people around you will start to understand that you're just not, they're not able to work with you in that way, So these ACA traits, I mean, pointing that stuff out was huge. But also as a kid, if I could just look at this, frightened of angry people, very frightened of angry people and authority figures. And that went on for a long time.
Sure. How did you used to respond to criticism? And you said earlier, like, you would fight it a little bit. What did you mean by that?
I would prove my point.
Yeah.
I would find supporting information to prove the point, that kind of thing. And there were times I would just lash back out.
Sure.
Or perceive that what they were saying was more of an attack than it really was.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I appreciate you sharing all that. So, I mean, even the lashing back out to me almost feels like it connects right on in to the other laundry list trait for this one. And I think it's a good example because the more we do these podcasts, people who listen are going to hear this. A lot of the traits connect together. You'll see ones kind of cover similar themes, and traits 1 and 3 have a lot of overlap. So if I'm frightened by angry people and any personal criticism, sometimes my response is going to be, I'm going to dig in. I'm going to become defensive in the sense of I'm going to prove that I'm right in this way and that the criticism's not valid. Because if I believe that criticism is valid, remember, that hits me kind of to my core based on what I experienced. Other times, people, who relate to trait 3 might be so afraid of criticism and so afraid of it being true that they go essentially the trait 2 route and they go back to approval seeking. I'm going to adopt whatever opinion and stance I can do so that I don't think you're going to criticize me in some way. And then other times, people kind of scoot over to the other laundry list side for this one, and we might turn to the lashing out. So I'm going to now frighten someone else with anger and a threat of criticism, go on the offensive, so to speak, all as a way to sort of keep the criticism at a distance. And the idea is like when we experience this stuff in our childhood, the threat is real, right? If what I experience is like yelling, screaming, or something that is making me feel like I am not worthwhile as a person, yeah, that's devastating. That's really emotionally painful. And then when I get into adulthood, though, and like you said, sometimes the threat's not there. Like this is a consultant group that's hired to help me in some way, but all of criticism is perceived as this threat now, so it triggers some of these, these reactions in some way.
And now that you brought it up, there was a part of me that would do some of the approval-seeking piece too.
Sure.
So I knew if my performance was just like when I was a kid, I knew if the performance was good,
Sure.
I would be in a better place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this is, just sort of a little speculation on my part, but I think that what people experience in their childhood down to kind of like even kind of minuscule interactions makes a difference here, because if I was a kid and I found some ways of getting approval, like if I was able to perform sometimes and I could get approval and the criticism would stop, I might be at least willing to try that in adulthood. But if I came from a home where truly, and I have worked with people like this, where it's just like, it didn't matter what I did, it was always constant, then they don't even bother with approval seeking, because why would they, right?
Right.
They don't have any template that would suggest to them that people are going to care. And so they tend to slant more towards other responses like the isolation or the defensiveness or going on the offensive, whatever. So in a roundabout way, we've actually kind of talked a little bit about the other laundry list side, which is we frighten people with our anger and threat of belittling criticism. This is, again, if we want to recall, I think I mentioned it in the Traits 1 and 2 podcast, talking about sort of the two big ways that children learn through essentially the adaptation or the observation. If I grew up in a home where there was a lot of anger, a lot of criticism, even if I was the target of it, I'm watching adults behave that way. And some part of me is kind of internalizing that, seeing, okay, sometimes adults behave that way, and it might even normalize it in some way. Even though it was painful to me, now in adulthood, I might find myself becoming that person on occasion. I think that another way that trait 3, if people relate to the other laundry list, can show up, it can show up in romantic relationships a lot. The partner we might have our partner who just says like, I feel like nothing I do is ever good enough for you. Why are you always criticizing me? You only point out the negatives in me. If that is something that people have heard or maybe even kind of know is a part of them, or they've gotten that feedback, it may be worthwhile, like a glance back into our childhood to ask ourselves, hey, where did I learn that?
Well, and if we watch that with our parents,
Yes,
that is really going to stir me up emotionally, when it happens in my own relationship.
definitely. Yeah, and if we saw that modeled, even if it was a negative thing, there's something about us having this template where we know that it can happen, and it does unfortunately make it a little more likely that we may recreate it.
Yeah, and if you're like me, when I was in a bad headspace, I am then going to use my examples and start feeling the feelings of what happened that I saw, and imagine that because something similar in terms of the argument or whatever it is, the criticism is happening right now, that I now am also going to experience all of the other things that I witnessed.
Yeah. I think that's...
And emotionally, that's a mess.
It is a mess. Because
It's a mess.
experiencing not just what's in front of me, but the whole line is other things all at once. Which, when we put it that way, especially in adult relationships, it can be kind of really like unfair to the person in front of us, because maybe they are being a little critical, but it's not that we're just responding to that. We're holding them accountable for all this other stuff that really had nothing to do with them. Right. Unfortunately. Yeah. Before we move to trait 4, one a thing that I wanted to share with people. These are kind of 3 questions that I think are really relevant towards ACA. Sometimes I'll even ask them in groups. But like, if people are going through the laundry list or hearing us talk about it and they're thinking, oh, I do find myself doing that. 3 questions that can be helpful, kind of self-exploration ones are, where did I learn that? Who did I see do that? And then the third kind of less common one that I'll use is, who allowed me to do that, or who watched me do this in childhood and did nothing. So the first one, where did I learn that, gets at the adaptation part. So people, when they ask themselves that, might say, well, I learned it by going through X, Y, and Z, and I learned that I had to isolate myself to get away from anger or criticism. Who did I see do that? Gets at the modeling. Did I see mom or dad do it? Did I see my siblings do it? Maybe I had, an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent who was as much of a caregiver, and I saw them do that to my parents, right? We can look into the broader family system, but who did we see behave in a similar way? And then the third one, I think, will become more relevant with some of these later traits we'll get to in probably future podcasts, gets at this thing which Terry Real and Pia Melody call false empowerment, which is that someone, essentially an adult who's supposed to help us learn and nurture us and provide boundaries for us, just sort of allowed us in childhood to do whatever we wanted, allowed us to behave in these ways without any really like proper guidance. And again, I don't mean that in a blaming way to that adult, but just sort of like that was sometimes the reality. That third question, like I said, I think has a lot of relevance for some later traits, but it's a question that I think sometimes is worth asking ourselves.
Yeah, and I could tell you, when I look at, let's say, the 70s, 80s, there are a lot of us that grew up with, in single-parent households, or parents weren't around as much, they were working, whatever. So I don't even know that the parents were giving permission
Yes.
to do whatever you wanted.
Yes.
It just so happened I'm there by myself and I make my decisions and that's what I do.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, just because of the lack of supervision, the lack of, anything, I just kind of got to do what I wanted.
Right.
Sure. Yeah. Shall we go to trait 4?
Absolutely. So trait 4 laundry list is, we either become alcoholics, marry them, or both, or find another compulsive personality, such as a workaholic, to fulfill our sick abandonment needs. And the other laundry list is, we dominate others and abandon them before they can abandon us, or we avoid relationships with dependent people altogether to avoid being hurt. We isolate and dissociate and thereby abandon ourselves. So the first thing that I see from personal experience would be, I did often find, people that had issues, maybe they weren't alcoholics, but the beginning stages of it, or, certainly people that had difficulty at times opening up. Either they couldn't open up, or they were just very emotional, So the abandonment needs piece, I get that.
Sure.
On the other side of that, I never really was one to abandon someone before they abandoned me. I attribute this to my codependency, so I wasn't willing to jump out. We talk about people are afraid that their independence will be taken from them or whatever. That wasn't really me. I did not like to be hurt ever, but I was often hurt, and so much of it came from how I responded to things.
Sure. When you say that I was drawn to people with dysfunction in their past or stuff going on, were you drawn to people who were really highly emotional and, all over the place, and you were the stabilizing force for them? Were you drawn to people who came from dysfunction but were hyper independent, rigidly self-sufficient? Was that a pattern?
It was a little bit of both.
Okay.
I'd say the couple rigidly self-sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
And then for some of the relationships, I was just attracted to the commonalities
Sure.
in the dysfunction that they came from.
Yeah.
Kind of like, hey, I get you.
Mm-hmm.
I understand you. You understand me. We were meant to be, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Then you start getting into soulmates and twin flames and all that other stuff.
Yes. A term that often comes up around trait 4, we'll talk about trauma bonding,
Mm-hmm.
I think is just a new age term for essentially what you're describing there, which is what I have gone through becomes the sort of sole basis of my identity and the sole basis by which me and this person bond. And can be a challenging place to create the basis for a relationship, because what happens when one person begins to try to shift past that or heal? It sort of destabilizes the foundation of the relationship in a strange way. But yeah, I think that trait 4, people are often drawn to people who, I would say, their patterns in that relationship are going to mirror or match in some ways things that they grew up with. Because remember, like a big part of what we're talking about here is that the patterns we experience in adulthood aren't coming from nowhere. Like, they don't just pop out of thin air. And so if I'm going to be in a relationship in adulthood and I'm with someone who I perceive to be, quote unquote, healthy and aren't really displaying any of the patterns that I'm used to or know about or have seen, no matter how dysfunctional I may know that they are, sometimes people can say they feel kind of uncomfortable in those relationships, or it can feel confusing or boring. That's a very common one. People like that are very boring. So they're more drawn towards relationships that are going to match a level of dysfunction that they're kind of used to.
And chaos, little chaos.
Yes, and chaos as well. On the other laundry list side, we dominate others and abandon them before they can abandon us. I think that gets to the sort of fear of closeness one. I think you mentioned that. It's a little bit of trait 2, other laundry list is in this one. But the people who I don't want to be with a dependent person at all, because dependency is very scary to me, or perhaps overwhelming if I was like an emotional caretaker for a dysfunctional or maybe addicted caretaker. And then, to avoid being hurt, we isolate and dissociate, thereby abandon ourselves. That's a tough one. I think that, I don't know how you would feel about this, but I mean, I often associate being in an active addiction stage as sort of like pretty strongly connects to the word abandonment, right? If I'm in active addiction, kind of by definition, my primary need in those spaces is in maintaining and fueling my addiction. And when I'm in that space, I can't really afford to be responsive to or present for other people in my life. And I certainly can't afford to be present or responsive to my own needs. In fact, that's sometimes the whole reason that I'm engaging in the addictive behavior in the first place.
Right. And I'll tell you, when I was in addiction, I didn't even recognize, that I had my own needs, and I was abandoning myself because it appeared at the time that I was doing what I liked to do, which was addicted behavior, for myself. So
Yes.
I don't know that. I don't know that I ever looked at it as I was abandoning myself. However, certainly today I can look back and say, absolutely. I mean, I had no clue who I even was for a long, 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 long time.
Yeah. That's what I think is so tough about this trait. Because I think you're spot on that when we're in the middle of doing that, very few people are going to view that as self-abandonment. And maybe even some people listening might even think, well, I don't know if I really see it But I just want people to know that I think that, like, especially if you grew up in a household where you saw someone who had an active addiction, you probably have a pretty strong sense of when they were engaging in that addictive behavior, they really were not present for anyone else in the household. And they maybe really were not even all that attentive to or taking care of their own needs. That may have fallen to you as a child or someone else in the family, and all sorts of other ripples ensue. So if we find that, much like the laundry list side says, we kind of recreate that, we become an alcoholic, addict of any variety, we are kind of doing the same thing. And I really appreciate that the laundry list mentions, they just say another compulsive personality, such as a workaholic. But I mean, we can equate this to lots of other
Oh, it could be anything.
Yeah, any forms of escapism where that becomes the thing that we chase and we have to do it. And it almost has this compulsive quality to it, to the point where we then are neglecting parts of our relationships or parts of ourself. And I think that's a danger that, any person really can fall into. But certainly I would say if someone grew up with dysfunction in the household are probably at, an increased risk of.
Well, yeah, the idea of having someone that is unavailable is something that you're used to. So, if they have a compulsive personality, it's easy to fall into that.
Yes.
So, Stephen, overall, there are 14 traits on the laundry list.
That's correct.
14 traits, and we've done 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Sure.
In the series so far. Next time we come back, we'll be on traits 5 and 6, and they're really good ones, right?
Yes. 6 in particular is one that, without fail, gets a ton of discussion. But I think 5 is a sleeper pick as well, too.
It's a cliffhanger. Join us next time for the ACA podcast.